very pleased on behalf of the network to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country. From where I'm sitting, it's the Boonwurrung, and they're part of the Kulin Nation. I'm from the southeastern area of Victoria, just sort of north of Wilson's Prom, and their territory runs from all the way from the Port Phillip Bay, around Western Port Bay and down to Port Phillip. So I'm happy to acknowledge the traditional owners from this area and the traditional owners from all of the areas from which you come. Our first speaker is John Harris, who's the Director and Principal Zoologist, Ecologist with Wildlife and Ecology, an ecological consultancy based in Melbourne. He has 17 years of teaching secondary maths and science prior to this. However, he continues his desire to educate students and community members alike about our unique animals and plants, and has continued that in his new role with the consultancy. Today we're looking at something that I'm very keen on, and that is the notion that the important notion, I think, that wildlife doesn't just live in the bush. It's important because of the development particularly across Victoria, that we acknowledge that wildlife exists across the landscape, which includes suburbia. And it's important for those of us who live in suburbia to acknowledge that and try to provide for that. So I think this is an important and useful place to start of this series. And so I welcome John and introduce him to speak to you. Thank you, John.
No worries. Thank you, Paul. So I was good to, didn't realise I was the first, but it's always good. Somebody's got to be the pioneer, I suppose, get the ball rolling. Just wanted to add to that, we also, our company we also do wildlife tourism and the importance of that as well. So we can get that started, get messages out to people, and that's part of what our company does in total. So good to see so many people tonight. You're never quite sure how many people are able to hook into this, but as I was talking to a lady yesterday, to get the spread much wider than turning up to a face-to-face meeting where you might get 20. This is something, I suppose, a positive from the coronavirus, that we can actually come on board and share presentations and things across a much wider audience, not just in local groups in Melbourne, but Victoria, interstate. And I also believe that there's at least one person from overseas who has booked into this to see this presentation. In regards to that, as it's primarily the First Friends of Dandenong Creek that are putting this together, a lot of the fauna and the area that we talk about is primarily focused on that Knox, Maroondah, Whitehorse area, council areas in eastern Melbourne. But the messages and things like that can be spread widely in terms of what are the issues facing wildlife, what can we do about it, and in fact some of the wildlife are common to many areas just outside Melbourne. So let me kick off this presentation. Okay, so I wanted a little catchy title about, that we are actually looking at the suburbs. We're not looking out in the bush. So fauna in the burbs, and not just the bush. As Paul was saying, the importance of, habitat, etc., in areas where it has been removed is extremely important if we're to continue the biodiversity of the area that we live in. It doesn't just become a monoculture of humans, cats and dogs. So just start off with some numbers, just to get a picture of where we're at in terms of what's happening in Victoria alone. So in the last 250 years, thereabouts, since Captain Cook first claimed Botany Bay effectively for the English, 65% of Victoria's natural bushland has been cleared. And since settlement, in fact, that's given another 30, 40 years thereafter. So that's a substantial amount of vegetation has been cleared from just Victoria alone in those 200 years. Therefore, it's essential that we actually, the remaining habitats that we have, whether they be little patches in the suburban parks, or whether they be larger areas, or whether it be national parks in the northwest or across Australia, those natural areas, it's important that they be protected and enhanced wherever possible. So wherever we can get out and do a little bit, and that might simply just be going and picking up some rubbish along the creek line or in your local park. But we'll look at how we can actually enhance our local environments a bit further on. So this presentation is going to take a look at three parts effectively. One, what do fauna need to exist anywhere? Two, what are the types of fauna that we potentially find in our backyards and in our local parks, etc., including some examples of each. And then three, what are some of the things that we can do to promote fauna being in our own living spaces, no matter how big our living space is or how small our living space is, what we can do to get it there. So this is roughly this has come off the nature kit run by the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. All these green areas that you see between Bayswater, Ringwood, around the Mullum Tunnel, Vermont South, Wanturna, etc., all those green areas and some of those bluer areas are the only remaining native vegetation that's been mapped in this part of the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Now, this is based on 2005 data. So this is what is used by consultants, etc., to determine, in some ways, if you've heard the term vegetation offsets. If people want to do a development somewhere and they've got native vegetation on their property, this is the type of information we use. So obviously you can see that there's not a lot left. And if it hadn't been for the fight by lots of people before the Eastern Freeway East Link was done, probably all this patch up here around Mullum Tunnel or above the Mullum Tunnel would not have existed either. So, kudos to those people that led that fight. So as we've seen in that slide, the reserve network across the three areas is quite fragmented. There's not a lot of, while there's lots of little reserves and council parks, etc., the actual reserves that are still relatively indigenous vegetation is quite fragmented. And that has all sorts of issues, particularly if you've got small pockets of organisms that only can't get through suburbia to get to the next patch where they can, breed, where they can share genetic stock, etc. So if they can't get out, then they become an isolated population. Genetic bottlenecking occurs because they're interbreeding effectively, and that has all sorts of issues. So that said, this is where we actually talk about these wildlife suitable backyards play an important role in the habitat for native species and stepping stones across the urban landscape, suburban landscape, so that animals can move through those areas and continue and continue living a relatively good existence in terms of genetics, environment, etc. So this little image here is a eastern spinebill, a local honeyeater. taken just outside my front yard. So a lot of these photos here that we're using tonight are actually based on where I live in Croydon, on 450 square metres, and the area outside my front door. So they're not some huge block out of suburbia. They're middle of the burbs, small lot, but what we can achieve. Just so it puts into context about, we're talking about backyards and things. This is literally a backyard. So there's a number of things that wildlife anywhere need, not just here, but anywhere across Australia, anywhere across the world, they need a number of key things. Firstly, they need somewhere to live. Then they also need somewhere to shop. And I put this in, a lot of this is put it into human context. We've got to go to the supermarket, local market, butcher, baker, wherever to get the food that we need to exist. Organisms need to do the same thing. Somewhere to mate, breed, and some source of water to survive. Pretty much, if you're going to survive and populate and continue to reproduce, the 4 basic things that you need. So let's have a look at the first one. So some shelter. The requirements for individual wildlife are as varied as the possibilities that they are as varied as the requirements themselves. So it might be, in this instance, in this photo, a log on the ground could provide shelter for some reptiles, some invertebrates underneath, potentially frogs, etc. So, like our own homes, wildlife have to feel safe from predation and the elements if they're going to survive. They need to be able to get out of the way if there's a bird of prey flying through. They need to be able to get themselves out of the wind, out of the rain. If they can't do that, then really there's nothing that is going to keep them in your area on a regular basis. The same for home. We have a home. That's the things that we like from our home. Safe from etc. Elements. So in this case, this is a large tree in my neighbour's next door. Provides a whole range and provides shelter, hollows, etc. So arboreal mammals and lots of birds require trees, arbor, tree, lots of birds and the resources they provide. So this tree here, for instance, would provide somewhere to perch, some feeding resources, some food amongst the leaves, under the bark, somewhere to roost if you're a parrot or a possum in a hollow, etc. Reptiles, frogs, and the small mammals that we might find on the more peri-urban areas of a large city. Well, the reptiles and frogs we can find in closer, but the small mammals, such as Antechinus, etc., that we might find right out on the peri-urban, that's the very outer fringe of the rural urban interface. Often need ground cover, mulch, logs, rocks, etc. And the smaller birds need shrubs so that they can get out of the way of being harassed, to breed in, to provide food resources. One way of providing some of that ground cover, if you're not wanting to bring in logs, etc., because obviously logs have come from somewhere else, unless it's come from a tree that's been cut down, is to use something like roofing tiles. I have a number of roofing tiles spread throughout our garden, just on the ground. Provides great shelter for invertebrates, reptiles, etc. They need food. So many different dietary needs. We've got nectivores, we've got frugivores, so the fruit eaters. insectivores, we've got herbivores, we've got carnivores, we've got seed eaters, etc. So there's a whole range. So having a garden that provides a smorgasbord increases the potential for fauna, different varieties of fauna to call your garden the home that, home that they're looking for. So you've got, in this case, this is a Coria reflexa. Those eastern spinebills on that first slide actually quite heavily feed on the Coria during that time of the year, as well as other birds get in amongst it and look for insects, etc. So a diverse garden is like we were talking about before, is like a supermarket. It has something for everyone, regardless of what your diet is. So having water in a garden, such as a bird bath or a pond, can be rewarding and beneficial. However, there's some things you need to remember. So that fauna, if you've got it there the whole time, fauna will become reliant. Fauna will visit that bird bath when they need water or when they need to have a splash around, a puddle, a wash, etc. And it's not just a fill and forget activity. You chop it up and it's all good, but then 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, and particularly during that summer period, that warmer weather, a bird bath can, the water can evaporate regularly. And if birds become, used to going to, that's where they're getting their water from, and it's not there, you've effectively got them so used to coming to this spot, and then it's not there, and then they've got to go off and they've got to then find water elsewhere, particularly if they've been relying on that, such as through a breeding season or something. So fill it, keep your eyes open. If it's dropping down, organise it to fill it again. If you're going away on holidays, get your neighbour to pop in and fill your bird bath if you've got one. That's if you can get away on holidays at the moment. So ideally, for a water source, there needs to be some shelter nearby. Small birds and things often aren't going to come out in the open to have a bath, because while they're in the bath, they're flipping around, they're concentrating on what they're doing, they're less attuned to any predators. If they're further away, then something happens, catches them by surprise, they've got further to go before they can find that shelter that they might require. If it's deep, if the water's deep, put a perch or something in it. If you've got a pool even, put something in it that fauna can get out. The number of fauna, whether it be frogs, reptiles, etc., that get caught in backyard pools, and they just can't get out, it can be quite high. People talk after really rainy weather, lots of frogs on the move, they get in the pool, they can't get themselves out, they drown. It's not what we're after. So a perch, whether it be a stick effectively sitting across the water so that the birds could come and land on the water, drink, and then fly off. And as the water level drops, the stick drops with it, so they don't actually have to get off the stick to get into the water. Something like that is always very helpful in terms of birds and wildlife getting access to the water. Because the last thing you want to do is set up a water environment that then you go out one day and there's something, that you've been trying to encourage for a while, and then you find that actually it's dead in the water bath because it couldn't get out. It's not a pleasant experience. So somewhere to breed, a couple of frogs in amplexus, just to set the scene. For hollow-using fauna, breeding sites can be in short supply in the suburbs. We've taken out a lot of trees, and if you go, we've taken out a lot of trees. We've put in all sorts of other trees that may not necessarily form hollows, and therefore hollows are in short supply. Moths and butterflies often need larval food plants to breed successfully. So it's not just somewhere to lay the eggs, but somewhere for their larvae to feed on, and then they can move on with the stages of life. So you've got to find, it's got to be things that cover each of those stages of life. And food needs to be an ample supply to support the family. You know, a couple of moths or a couple of insects in the garden aren't necessarily going to support a whole family as birds go through their breeding phase. So, you know, birds are backwards and forwards the whole time to the nest pretty much while they're feeding their chicks. So what's the importance of trees? Again, this is a tree that's actually had the top cut out of it in the last few months, literally on my street. So it's got lots of hollows in it. And when they were taking the top out of it, I spoke to the arborist and I said, oh no, we're leaving the tree, we're just taking the canopy off because we're just taking off what's considered to have been dangerous. So they've actually effectively made it into a habitat tree, or by removing the dangerous material that was sitting up in the canopy. And you'll see lots of councils these days are doing the same thing. Instead of cutting down dead old trees, they're taking off the thinner branches that are more likely to snap off, and leaving the more solid trunk and main branches in place because they provide habitat. So trees provide a service to the environment. We know that, but what are they? Shelter, whether it be the hollows, the cracks in the trunk, the bark, the trunk itself, whether it be roots underground, whether it be fallen timber around the base. They provide shelter for all sorts of vertebrates and invertebrates. Provide a food source, whether it be the leaves, such as if you're a koala or a glider, flowers for honey eaters, sugar gliders, insects, possums, the sap. Sugar gliders love the sap, often eat sap of many trees. So that food source is again an important situation. And they also provide hollows and other breeding places. So just a little quiz. This is the same tree. You can see that there's a back end of an animal sitting here. It's in a hollow. And what I noticed yesterday is this hollow has actually been drilled into the tree rather than a naturally occurring hollow like there was in other parts of the tree. And if you're not sure what it was, what it is, well, I'll let you think about that for a moment. So one of the most important values of the trees is the formation of hollows. Now there's around, you did a quick calculation recently, there's around 70 species of fauna in outer eastern Melbourne that require hollows to breed. Now that's just in the suburban area of Melbourne, it's not out into the bush. So we're talking parrots and cockatoos, we're talking possums, we're talking microbats, we're talking all sorts of other organisms that require those hollows. So the hollows provide the shelter and the breeding resource that's needed for a large variety of fauna, as we just said. However, hollows can take decades to form. There's, some from the time a tree is a bud growing out of the ground till it forms a hollows in some species can take well over 100 years. So definitely more than my lifetime, and half the lifetime of my kids almost before they form hollows. So they're a desperate resource that's needed if we're going to continue to have fauna, particularly arboreal fauna and tree-dwelling fauna in our environments. So these are the guys that are actually in that nest. So the pair of kookaburras using that tree, that hollow that's been put in that tree as a nesting site. So what are the fauna in the burbs? So they can be numerous. They can range from mammals to birds, reptiles, fish in the local creeks, down to invertebrates. Make up the invertebrates, as across the rest of the world, make up the largest proportion of animals by species and by weight in our neighbourhoods. Butterflies, moths, ants, worms, insects, and even our favourite spiders, flies and cockroaches are all part of that invertebrate fauna that live in our in our local environments. This is, if you're not sure, this is a St Andrews cross spider, given the name by the thickening of the web in a diagonal, in a cross, similar to the cross of St Andrews that appears on the Scottish flag, that white cross on the blue background, hence its name. So most of the invertebrates that we have around the suburbs are native, apart from those black millipedes, and they're a Portuguese millipede. A lot of them are Portuguese millipedes that often come out in huge numbers, erupt in huge numbers each year. There are some cockroaches, etc., that are not native, but a lot of them are native. So most of our invertebrates that we find in our houses, in our backyards, in our neighbourhoods are actually native.
John, sorry to interrupt. It's Paul here.
Yes, Paul.
There are people who still have their microphones on. I think you probably have the ability to mute all, but I just ask everyone to mute their microphones. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. No worries. I didn't pick that bit up. Okay, so let's look. Let's have a look at some of the local fauna. What do local fauna need? So butterflies are definitely a welcome sight in any garden throughout the year. Some, depending on what the food plants are of the butterfly, what the seasonality of that plant growing means that there will be butterflies, different butterflies across the year that come out that appear in our gardens. Need food plants for the larvae, but they also need plants that the adults can get nectar from. That's not such a drama for most butterflies because they will quite happily live on, get nectar out of exotic flowers, whether daisies or a whole range, anything you can practically find at a Bunnings or a general nursery. If it produces nectar, and butterflies are able to access it, they will. But it's the food plants that the larvae need is the critical requirement. So the food plants might include things like the mat rushes, or some people might know them as by their scientific name, lamandra, whether it be grasses, wattles, or acacias, even stinging nettles. The yellow admiral or the Australian admiral, actually the larval food plant for the caterpillars are the stinging nettles, whether they be introduced or the native stinging nettles. Daisies, peas, and even citrus, so oranges, lemons, etc., will have their own butterfly species. As the dingy swallowtail or the orchard swallowtail, this one is actually, again, from our backyard, just made a living. And it's this individual and a couple of others made a living on our small lemon tree just in a pot. Went through the whole stage, pupated, and then emerged a few days to a couple of weeks later as the adult butterflies. Nectar sources, so it can be both native and exotic plants. They also like a sunny, sheltered position where they can sunbake and are often basking on rocks and paths, etc. If you think about when you walk through the bush, you get to a sunny little patch, and often you'll disturb a butterfly that was just sitting there absorbing the sun in that little patch. So we're talking about rocks. We'll come back and talk about rocks again a bit later. But just remember, it's not just the reptiles, etc., that like it, but butterflies like the positions where they can sun themselves as well. Okay, so we know about some of the mammals. So we know about the possums particularly that may use our backyard. But there's more than just possums, and most of the rest we probably have never heard of, and most likely never seen. These guys and girls, you often don't know they're even there. So these are the microbats. So little bats that hang around, insectivorous. So here's a couple of examples of microbats here. Now that is a thumb in a glove. That little microbat is a little forest bat, and that's as big as it gets. So if you remember, if you stick out your thumb and it sits on the end of your thumb, it's not very big. Talking to kids, I normally say it weighs less than a 10-cent piece, or about the weight of 2 pieces of chewing gum. The bigger bat at the bottom, a white striped freetail bat. You can just make out a bit of a white stripe here. So when it actually opens its wings, underneath on the body, there's a white stripe on both sides under the wing here. This is our largest bat, micro bat anyway, that we see around the suburbs. And this is the only bat that we can hear, or generally 99.8%. There is another bat that comes down that is heard occasionally, recorded occasionally around Melbourne. But this is the one that we're most likely to hear if you're of an age where your hearing is still good enough to hear it. So if you're around, not being ageist, but if you're around 60 or older, chances are you will not hear this bat. It broadcasts its echolocation at about 15 hertz, so which is the upper end of our hearing. And if you've aged, you've probably, the chances are most people have lost that upper range, so they don't hear this bat and would probably never even know it's there. And it just sounds, most people even think it sounds like an insect. So it's it just sounds like an insect unless you know what it is. So diet consists almost entirely of night-flying insects such as mozzies and moths. Now, who doesn't like to get rid of a few mozzies? Some of these bats will eat up to half their body weight or more in a night of night-flying insects. So beetles, moths, you name it. If it's flying and they can find it, they'll have it. So they roost in tree hollows or cracks, sometimes under eaves, and even in the roofs and walls of houses. If there's a spot that they can get in, doesn't have to be very large. Like a crack might only need to be a centimetre wide or less. As long as the bats can get in through that crack, they'll then live quite happily. And often you don't know they're there unless you hear the little squeaking of a night as they're starting to get ready to move out, to fly out as they're waking up. The other bat that we know of, and most people know of this one, and has been given a bad rap, particularly in the last 8 months, is other flying foxes. These guys, so this is a grey-headed flying fox. These guys are frugivores and nectarivores. They'll actually live on the nectar of flowering gums and things like syzygiums and things, but they'll also like fruit, whether it be fruit off native fruit trees, again like lily-pillies, or whether it be your backyard apricots, pears, whatever. They're a frugivore. Number of colonies throughout Melbourne. The biggest one is in Kew at the Bellbird Reserve in Kew, beside the Kew golf course there. That can have 60 or 70,000 or more bats during the summer period, and down to maybe between 5 to 10,000 over winter. There's another population down at Myna Farm, down the back of Myna Farm, down on the peninsula. There's populations in Geelong. I think there's now a population in Bendigo. There's coming and going from areas like Warrnambool. Bairnsdale has a population. Sydney Botanic Gardens has a population. So they're spread out. These bats, however, are a nationally endangered species. And there's been lots of issues about some of the local councils not liking them in particular areas, so cutting down trees so that they don't come back. And because of COVID, and at one stage the reported origins of potentially where this virus had come from, kind of got a few more people scared that didn't fully understand their role, and turned a lot more people against the flying foxes. If it wasn't for the flying foxes, of all varieties, so there's a number of varieties across Australia, if it wasn't for the flying foxes, a lot of our big forest trees like mountain ash, etc., would not have pollinators, so would not be as pollinated as successfully, and rainforest trees, etc., therefore not being able to maintain, well, a logging industry, if we look at it on the money side of it, or a natural environment if we look at it on the ecological side. If they eat the fruit, they suck the juice out of it, they either spit the seeds out or they defecate them out the other end, helping to spread those seeds in nice fertiliser packets across the environment. So they play an important role in our environment. If only, you know, and I think it's through lack of education and knowledge and appreciation is why, you know, they get such a bad rap. So our common brush-tailed possum. So we're going to look at some of the local species. Common brushies, people will know them, you know, in the house, in the roof, pull their hair out, trying to get them out, etc. What do? They're in the backyard, they eat the fruit, they, you know, have been known to eat the dog food and the cat food and all sorts of things. The one on the left here in the nest box, this is a mum with a joey. There's a joey in there as well, and they're crammed into this nest box in my backyard. A couple of years ago, they were so crammed in, the joey was so big that mum actually had her head and arms outside the nest box every day sleeping while everybody else was tucked in. So I felt a bit, you know, uneasy about that. So I thought I'll make them another box and we'll have a look at that other box later. In the other box in my backyard is this guy. He's my local. Brushy, you can see he's had a fairly old animal, I believe. He's had parts of his ear ripped open and things like that. He lives in that nest box probably about, I'd say 6 months of the year. In the previous nest box, there was a male living at one night, and then the next night it was unoccupied, and then the third night it had the mum and joey. So 2 out of 3 nights was fully occupied. If it was a motel, it would have been really great. You know, 66% occupancy every night of the year. You know, over 3 nights is pretty good. The eastern ring-tailed possum. There is also a western ring-tailed possum that lives in WA. So the eastern ring-tailed possum, again a local, often seen crawling along the power lines, etc. Doesn't often nest in people's homes, but will live in hollows and also makes these large stick nests called drays. They live in the hollows, but they will nest in drays as well. So they'll make these nests in a tree. There might be 3 or 4, or potentially even 5 in there. They'll come and go from that each night, and then they might only be there for a few weeks, and then they'll move to another dray, move around 4 or 5 different drays in the neighbourhood. A couple of reasons for that. Potentially, it's one, to avoid predators, so the predators don't get used to the animals coming and going from the same nest every night. And secondly, it's also thought that it may assist with parasites. Excuse me. It may assist with parasites. If they're able to move off to another dray and not come back for a few weeks, they break that parasite cycle that might be in that dray. So that's a couple of issues. So the the ringies, fairly cute, and because they're also prone to get on the ground and things like that, they're often a victim of being hit by cars, which is unfortunate. Excuse me. And then one of the other animals we have is now the sugar glider that we used to know it as has been split. So taxonomically been found to be 3 different gliders. So the ones we have around Melbourne are now called the Krefft gliders. The ones around Brisbane and down the east coast of New South Wales are the sugar glider, and there's also a savanna glider that lives in the Northern Territory. But these guys, like this one in particular here, is showing an example, has cut open, ripped open the bark with its sharp teeth, and is lapping at the sap of a wattle tree. And then here's a little family all just tucked in a nest box. They make a green leaf nest effectively, and then can be, I've heard of stories where there's 14 different gliders in a single hollow. Then we have these microbats, the ones we were talking about earlier, quite small. These two are probably the most common bats across the suburbs. So the Gould's wattled bat here, so it's got a dark head and a lighter body. And the lesser long-eared bat, big ears, similar, but yeah, so these are highly, you'll see that particularly these guys out of night just after dusk in the summer, often just flittering around through the burbs, off to feed on insects. These are the two we talked about earlier, the white-striped freetail bat and the little forest bat. So this is the one that fits on the end of your thumb. So let's have a look at, the birds now. Okay, so birds can be, some of the most colourful wildlife we find in our gardens. Whether it be something like this immature male gang cockatoo feeding on gang cockatoos, right? Feeding on white beech, amelia, or a lilac tree, etc. fruit beside my driveway. They have a varied diet, so they can be seed eaters, such as the parrots, or finches if you're lucky, nectar eaters, for the honey eaters, insectivores. Honey eaters will also feed on insects. Or reptiles even, kookaburras, for instance, will feed on the reptiles. So a varied diet: carnivores, herbivores, frugivores, insectivores. They can play a role in pest control. So if you've got wattlebirds or something like, we have wattlebirds here, and often see the wattlebirds picking off the leaf insects on some of our creepers, keeping those pest numbers under control. Magpies, etc., will help control various pests, particularly the insect pests. To shelter, some like prickly or dense shrubs or hedges are important, particularly for the small birds, and we'll talk a bit more about why that is a little later, especially if it's near water, so they've got that protection, so they can get in, have some water, have a bath, and get out of there in a hurry. So in your diverse garden, you find some small birds have their own space. Often in parks where it's mainly trees, in the local park where it's mostly trees, you might find noisy miners, and you won't find generally not find any small birds, wrens, scrubwrens, parrots, etc. Because the noisy miners are bossy, they'll drive the birds out. If there's space for the small birds to get in amongst the shrubs and get a different layers of vegetation, that enables the small birds to get in there, feel safe. The bigger birds aren't going to hassle them because they're not able to get in amongst those shrubs, etc. If you've got some water around your suburb, around your block, etc., in your neighbourhood, chances are you'll probably find some Australasian Swamphen. If it's a bit bigger, and Nankeen night heron, as the name suggests, is a night heron or comes out at dusk. Not often seen out during the middle of the daytime. Will roost in trees, etc., and fly to the wetland to feed overnight. Eastern great egret, and there's a Pacific black duck in the background. So this is our tallest white bird, and the way I remember it is they have a question mark in the neck. So this here comes around and forms, if you can imagine, a bit of a question mark over, which helps to distinguish it from the other species of egrets that may be around. The crimson Rosella and its source bottle relative, the eastern Rosella, some of our most vivid, brightly coloured birds that we see in parklands, in backyards, etc. Feeding on fruit, maybe in the trees, feeding on the ground. The two species of Corellas, short-billed Corella over here and the long-billed Corella here. You notice here the short-bill's got quite a crest on it. The long-bill doesn't have such a crest. Long-bill's got lots of red around the face, the short-bill doesn't. And of course the long-bill has a long bill and the short-bill, or the little Corella, has a short bill. Now, 40 years ago, long-billed Corellas were considered vulnerable to extinction in Victoria. They're now widespread not only in Victoria, but this photo is actually taken from Perth. So they're quite happily over there. 20 years ago, a short-billed, a little Corella in Melbourne would have been something to note from a bird watcher's point of view. During and following the millennium drought in the early 2000s, large numbers of birds that lived in more bush, more inland areas started turning up in the suburbs. Another one is crested pigeons, started turning up in the suburbs, and they've found that they can make quite a good living here, and they've stayed. Plane trees and things like that all help, although the residents who have plane trees out the front of their houses don't particularly like them, especially during the season when the plane tree balls are have fruited and they're just a massive seed. Rainbow lorikeet, a nectivorous parrot. In fact, likes nectar. On the end of its tongue, it's got a brush. So when it goes to a flower, the brush on the end of the tongue it picks up all the nectar, and then it flies to the next flower, and in that way helps pollinate the trees and shrubs that it feeds on. It can be bossy. I have seen rainbow lorikeets pulling fur out of a possum because the possum's in the hollow that they want to nest in. So it hops up, pulls out fur, jumps back, and then the next one hopped down. I think it was 4 rainbow lorikeets all hopping in, taking their turn, pulling fur out of the back of this possum while it was trying to sleep. King parrot, particularly in the eastern suburbs, outer eastern suburbs. This is a male. Beautiful bird. Lots of people see them around Grand's picnic ground in the Dandenongs. Don't need to go that far because this is on my seat outside my back door. This is a young male. You can see the red starting to come in the head here. Females don't have that red head or the vivid red of the male. Little scrubwren, often in parks, can be found in patches of blackberry, thick vegetation along creeks, etc. Got quite excited when we had a pair turn up out the front of our house earlier in the year. Wondered what bird is that? I haven't heard that bird calling around my house before. Walk out front, there's a pair of them jumping around in the prickly acacias out the front. Often seen, they can get, if you give a bit of a, in areas where they are, they'll get quite vocal. Come out and check out what's going on. And then you've got the magpie and the Magpie-lark. Magpies, the best football team in Australia. Now let's go one further, the best AFL team in the world. We'll go that far. A resident, you generally have whitebacks in Melbourne. You go inland and you get blackback magpies. And there is a patch where you've kind of got an intermediate between a white and blackback. This is a Magpie-lark or a peewee or a Murray magpie, a whole range of different names. This is actually a female. It's got a white face. If it was a male, this patch of white here in front of the eye would be all black. So a male has an all black face, a female has a white face. Now, is it a Myna or is it a Myna? People often get these confused. The one on the left is a noisy Myna, which is an Australian native honey eater. The one on the right is a common Myna, or it used to be called Indian Myna, which is an introduced species. They can be both aggressive. This one, as I said previously, often picks on small birds, particularly in park zones where there's primarily trees and not a lot of undergrowth. This one, the exotic one, will fight over will nest in hollows, fight over hollows, etc., and compete with native birds for nesting hollows, which native birds have enough problem, finding a nesting hollow without having to compete with an introduced species. The reason why the noisy Myna is called a Myna is because it has a black face, black eyes, etc., which reminded early people of a coal miner that had just come up from underground. That black around the eyes, that black face. That's why it's called a Myna, as we'd think of a coal miner, a gold miner. And this is a Myna with an M-Y-N-A. Not to be confused, one's a native, one's an exotic species. Then if we're really lucky, we'll have tawny frogmouths in our suburbs. Often see them of a night flitting across in front of the car, maybe sitting on a telephone pole, a light pole or something, catching insects around. Probably more known in the birds, there's more of them in the burbs than people realise. And then if you're really lucky in some areas, you got powerful owls. Powerful owl is our biggest owl in Australia and one of the largest owls in the world. And their favourite prey is ringtail possums. It's nothing to see a powerful owl sitting on a perch with half a ringtail. So probably the front head, the front half's gone first and the back half's for tomorrow night. A pair will go through average of a possum a day. And when they're breeding, it's probably closer to 2 possums a day. Half each, and then half for and then half each for an offspring. There have been records of these guys in Blackburn, around Blackburn Lake. I know they're in the Warrandyte area, Park Orchards area, and further out. But they're a substantial. They're one of our, as I said, they're one of our largest predators and our largest owl. All right, so let's have a look at some of these guys, some of these reptiles. They're probably not the most welcome wildlife in anybody's backyard. Well, I can't say anybody. There's a lot of us herpetologists that quite like snakes, particularly. In fact, if you're watching some of the early morning TV shows this morning, a lady who said her toilet wasn't flushing properly. She lifted off the cistern and there was 4 tree snakes. This was in North Queensland. There was 4 tree snakes living in the cistern of her toilet. Not the thing you want to find when you're actually trying to work out what's going on with the toilet itself. So while we've got snakes, most of the reptiles in our suburbs are small egg-laying skinks. And if you're lucky, you may get to see a blue tongue, an eastern blue tongue or a blotched blue tongue in the suburbs. This reptile here is a weasel skink. Easiest way to identify this one is it's got an orangey coloured tail, but it's got this little white teardrop under the eye. A local skink to many suburbs, and particularly in eastern Melbourne. They like to bask on the rocks and paths a la butterflies, and tiles or logs, etc. in your garden helps create a habitat for these guys. Tussocks and leaf litter are also great for shelter, but they also provide lots of invertebrates, etc. for food. And then just a close-up. So this is this white little tear that I was saying before. Easiest way to identify is if you see the skink under the eye, easiest identifying characteristic for this lizard. And then here's two others, garden and the grass king. So they're both in the same genus, Lamprophilus. This is a Guccianotti, and this is a Delicata. So you can see it's got this faded black pattern running down the vertebrae. This one doesn't. It's got a more coppery head and the body colour changes. This one's got more of a uniform colour. And there's a couple of others. There's a McCoy skink that has a little yellow belly that lives in leaf litter and mulch, etc. in the garden, in some gardens. And there is a range of other small skinks that you might find depending on where you're living. Then you've got something like this, tiger snake. Tiger snakes, copperheads are primarily the snakes of the suburbs. Towards northern Melbourne, you're probably potentially getting eastern brown snakes. Further east and occasionally down the peninsula and other spots, you get a red-bellied black snake as well. But these guys are part of the environment. They help knock off the mice, rats. They'll also feed on frogs, small birds, etc. Just give them if you keep if you don't have lots of things lying around in your backyard, chances are they won't be there. But at least give them the respect. Most people who get bitten by a snake are actually trying to kill it first. And the snake's only doing what anybody else would do. If somebody's trying to, kill you, give you a beating or something, and what you're going to want to fight, you're going to want to fight back. Great, love them, but very respectful of them. And that's probably the way to be with all our fauna, is just respect what they are and let them go about their business. So this is an eastern blue tongue. It has stripes across the body, right to the very tip of the tail. There is also a blotched blue tongue, which instead of having stripes has patches, pinky white blotches, as the name suggests, as opposed to stripes. They're also found in some of the eastern suburbs. So these will turn up in places where you don't necessarily think they would be. Doing some work out in the western suburbs last week, and there was just a pile of rocks in the middle of a bit of a grassy paddock, pretty much, and we pulled up two blue tongues from underneath the rocks before they were moved out of the way. So so it doesn't take much for them to find a bit of habitat. So frogs are great. Probably my first love as a wildlife type. You can have a pond, but ponds aren't essential, but ponds do provide a more long-term environment for the frog to live in. So somewhere to live, somewhere to breed, somewhere for the tadpoles, obviously. Happily to live in moist or well-watered gardens. I know I've heard quite a lot of frogs coming from gardens that are well-watered and not any body of water, like a pond or anything like that nearby. The ponds should have some vegetation, rocks, etc. around, just to provide some habitat so the frogs can get in under these rocks, logs, and then use the water if they need to, etc. Because obviously they've got to be kept moist. If a frog dries out, then it's cactus. A suggestion, putting mesh over a pond. There's been way too many small children drown in backyard ponds, and way too many only has to be one. But some mesh or something over there, or an area where kids cannot get into. And the mesh also helps keep herons and things like that. So if you've maybe got some fish in the pond, put some mesh over it, because I know of people who said, oh, we had a great collection of fish, and then we saw this bird kept coming in. It was moderately tall, grey, little white face, And then a week later, we realised we didn't have any fish because our herons are coming in, picking out the fish. So they'll do the same with tadpoles, etc. Now, I did see somebody raise a hand. Hopefully, Claire, we can get back to you, or if you can send a question in through the chat function, we can get back to you a bit later. Okay, and if you're really lucky, this is what you get. This is a brown tree frog, as was the one in the previous photo. I've been living here in this area for 10 years now, and it was only the last year that we've actually had brown tree frogs calling from our backyard. And in fact, this is a clematis, native clematis creeper on our side fence. This frog was hanging off the clematis near our water bowl, actually near our water bath a couple of months ago. Finally, we've got a frog in the backyard. So this is a brown tree frog here, as was the last one and the one previous. This one here is a Perrin's tree frog. You can tell this one, it's also called an emerald spotted. You can see some pale green spots across the body. The easiest way to tell this tree frog by looking at it is, unlike this one where the pupil is a slit across, the Perrin's tree frog here has a cross. So the slit goes across and up and down. They can see the down and the major slits through here. And it has what's being described as a maniacal laugh. So if it's wet during the summertime and you hear a mah, 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 that's a Perrin's tree frog. A couple other local frogs, we've got the striped and the spotted marsh frogs. The striped marsh frog sounds like top, 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 whereas the spotted's more tick, tick, tick. Banjo frog, or a pobblebonk, or used to be called a bullfrog, it's a common name bullfrog. They go bonk, 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 bonk. Found in lots of areas where there's a reasonable amount of water lying around. It doesn't have to be water all the year round. These animals they're a burrowing frog. They've been found in gardens. People have dug up their veggie garden and found them in their veggie garden. They will come out when it's wet. And the last one is a common eastern froglet. Sounds like, if you can imagine what a Geiger counter is supposed to sound like, creak, 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 creak. You've got this common little eastern froglet, and they will just they will breed in puddles in the park. It only has to be, 5-6 centimetres deep. And they're often, when the rain comes and those depressions fill up with water, they'll be often the first frogs in there to breed. So what does a diverse garden look like? I've had some tips along the way. This is a photo of Melbourne from the air. Gardens have animals that like to live at all sorts of heights. Now, I've been to the 35th floor of this building, the Eureka Tower. I wouldn't like to go to and I wouldn't have resisted the urge, it's not an urge for me, to go to the viewing platform of the Rialto. I don't like heights, but I'm happy that other animals, other humans do. They can live in the canopy of the trees or under the leaf litter on the ground, so there's a combination there. And I should have posted a quiz saying who would, of all these cartoon characters, who would you expect not to turn up in this presentation? Probably Shrek would have come close. So we're talking about a multi-story garden. So to get the variety of wildlife, gardens need to be like onions or ogres, that they have layers. Generally, the more layers a garden has, the more diverse it will be in the types of fauna that it can attract and keep, for that matter. Excuse me. Trees, tall shrubs, medium shrubs, ground covers, mulch, all combine to create that multi-story living space. You've got birds that will specifically only live in the canopy of the trees. You've got reptiles that only live on the ground, and you've got birds, mammals, etc., that will cross many of those different strata. So in creating the land, start with what you already have, unless you have a completely blank slate. So if it's trees, then look to get ground covers fit with the established plants. I'll show you some photos. This was my backyard when we bought the property in 2009. Over a couple of years, we undertook some plantings, hence what these bags are. So it's advisable to, to look, if you're looking at gardens, try and buy Indigenous plants that might be to your area. Now, there's a number of Indigenous nurseries that occur around the place, such as I think Knox Environment Group has an Indigenous nursery, and then there's Greenlink. They're in Ringwood, there's Candlebark at Muralbark. So there's a number of those nurseries around the place where you can buy Indigenous plants. There is a difference between Indigenous and native plants. Native plants could be native from anywhere in Australia. Indigenous plants are primarily what you would find in your local bushland, remnant bushland. So Indigenous plants are adapted to the local environmental conditions of an area. They also help provide, resources for particularly the more specialist types of fauna. Native plants will provide, resources for generalists, honey eaters, etc. This is what the garden now looks like. So we've got some lamanders, some tussocks here, some small shrubs, a Christmas bush, wattles, and this is a little grassland patch which has a whole range of native grasslands, some logs along the ground. This is the paper bark here is the tree where the possum nest box is in, that I showed you previously. So what can be achieved? Blank canvas, probably about 12 months later, a side fence at our place. So Indigenous plants require less nutrients and generally less water once they're established than many of the garden plants. Also provide food and shelter, as we've said, for local wildlife. So keep that in mind. That was 2009, that's probably 2011, and that's 2020. The clematis has formed a creeper right along the edge. The bird bath here, etc. So this is frequented by birds that are able to come in to feed in the bird bath and get out again. Like brown thornbills and things like that can get in amongst that thicker creeper, hop along, do what they need to do. Wattle bird comes to the bird bath and then goes and feeds on all the leaf hoppers, etc., that are in the clematis. So it's providing a garden. It doesn't have to be a large garden to provide some resources. Some Indigenous plants are considered. We'll flick through these reasonably quickly. Many do well in native or mixed gardens. So we've got some graminoids, so some mat rushes or lamandras. We've got some native grasses. And then we've got a range of ground covers and wildflowers. Running postman here provides runs across the ground as a creeper, a scramble, etc. across the ground. It provides habitat for reptiles and invertebrates, etc. underneath. Pattersonia is a nectar source, as are bulbine lilies and chocolate lilies. Nectar sources for insects, etc. So sarsaparilla, this is the clematis, and then you've also got a Billardia, appleberry. Three different types of creepers that can help provide that habitat. Prickly shrubs, so things like Acacia verticillata, or Bassarea spinosa. Bassarea spinosa is a food plant for the Eltham copper butterfly. Is a food plant for the Eltham copper butterfly in Eltham. Both provide quite thick, prickly type shrubs that are able to, to provide that dense shrubby areas that are required by some of the small birds. Then you've got grasses, so you've got kangaroo grasses, and this patch of lawn here is made up of Microlina stopoides, a weeping grass. It's the only patch of lawn we have in the whole, on our block. It's about 4 metres wide, but it's completely, the idea was completely to have a native grass lawn rather than a mixed grass lawn or a buffalo lawn or whatever else you might find. Then for the birds and insects, you've got things like some of the kunzias, some of the bottlebrushes, grevilleas, the banksias, etc., providing good nectar sources for both birds, insects. This is the backyard. No, sorry, this is the driveway to my house back in 2009. And that's what it looks like today. So a range of shrubs, etc., filled in those gaps, given us some privacy as well, but have created these habitats where we're getting brown thornbills and white-browed scrubwrens. There's a tawny frogmouth often in the tree here, a range of eastern spinebills, etc. Literally out the front door, and that's today. This tree here last year had this callistemon had eastern spinebills breeding in it last year. They love the correas that we've got through here. The thornbills live in these areas, in these Bassarias and the Acacia verticillatus, prickly moses, etc. So what can we do? The alternatives to tree hollows. Put up a nest box. Sounds like a great idea. If we're going to get high nesting fauna back into our environment, keep them in our local environments, they have to find something. So there's nest boxes. There's also a number of companies out creating hollows in trees, actually using arboricultural techniques to create hollows in trees as well. Easiest idea, go to Bunnings, go to the scrap bin, find some scrap timber, whip up a nest box, and it's all great. However, there's a whole range of specs, and there's books, and I've been working with Frankston City Council to produce a nest box book or a nest box document that looks at specs, etc., for the creation of nest boxes for different species. So if you go back to that photo of the possum that was wedged into the nest box with its young, I took pity on it. I created this nest box out of some timber, out of some plywood I picked up off the side of the road. The brush-tailed possums never used it, but within a fortnight I had this ring-tailed possum coming out of the nest box. Not quite your standard, it has a very large opening at the front, but worked really well. So design features for a nest box include the diameter of the entrance hole, whether it has an internal partition or not, the size. If you're trying to get something like a nest box for a sugar glider or brush-tailed phascogales that use the same thing, you put the hole at the bottom of the nest box and then you put a partition on the inside. So the animal has to come in through the hole, up the partition, and then build their nest over here. That stops things like common miners and other animals using the box because they can't get up the partition. So just a little trick like that will help allocate that nest box for a particular fauna species. Position of the nest box also needs to consider the fauna that use it and the weather conditions. So is it the worst weather coming from the south and the west? Well, then don't put a nest box on the west or the south side of a tree. Don't put it on the north side, because if you get exposed to a hot summer, the nest box is going to cook for most of the day. Generally put it on the east side if you can, if that's where the best weather conditions are. Now, what are some of the issues of nest boxes? They don't have the same, have the same insulation properties as tree hollows, so they may not be used throughout the year. They may be used for some of the year, and if it gets too cold, the animals move out somewhere else. If it gets too hot, the animals move out somewhere else. But generally, they can be used throughout the year if in the right conditions. Nest boxes also provide homes for feral species such as honeybees and common miners. This, and it's not just Australia, this is a photo of a nest box from Florida that I took on while I was over there on holidays, and it's a perfect example. Great idea, put up a nest box, but this one is chock-a-block, has a chock-a-block full beehive in it. Feral honeybees taking over hollows is actually a threatening process under the Victorian Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. So it's been identified as a process that threatens the existence of some of our native wildlife. As I said, common miners, bossy, they nest in it. If you have a nest box, or if you have a nest box and you check it occasionally and you see it's got bits of plastic and all sorts of things, wrappers, food, chocolate wrappers and stuff like that, it's a miner's nest. It's a common miner's nest. Remove it, plug up the hole so they can't get in, and let them go and find somewhere else. But the thing with nest boxes can never truly replace a tree hollow, because where there's one hollow, there's chances are that there's many more. Some more issues with wildlife, a whole lots of positives, but there are some negatives. So what are they? They include flying foxes, birds and possums eating your fruit. You planted an apricot tree or an apple tree, pear tree, cherry, whatever it is, plum tree, and the wildlife want it more than you. If you're happy to share and get some of it, or some say none of it, well then, okay. Possums living in your roof. I've had remove possums from our own roof and also from others. What do you do? How do you do it? Can be tricky at times. Feeding wild birds can be risky. Can be risking a friendship and not necessarily helping the birds at all. People put out seed every day. They feed the magpies or the currawongs mince meat or whatever. Often things like that, fat content from mince meat is often higher than what the birds would have in their natural diet. Think about what happens if we have too much fat in our diet. Putting out seed, the birds become reliant on you being there every day to do that. What happens if you go on holidays for a month? I've known of people who've gone on holidays, they've had a bird feeder on their balcony. Oh, lovely, you see the cockatoos, etc. come in, bird feeder on the balcony, they go on leave, go on holidays, come back in a month's time, the sulphur-crested cockatoos are ripped open all the western red-seated balustrading along the whole balcony because there's been no food. They've come to get it, there's not there, so what do? They sit around and just get bored and do what cockies do and rip it open. It's not necessarily providing a help for the birds, although it's a very English thing and a European thing to do, to put out suet and things like that over winter to help the tits and other small birds that live in those areas to survive. If you're going to feed the wild birds, do it irregularly, do it in small bits and pieces so they don't become reliant on it. You're not providing them their whole dinner. Get them out so they can still go and forage, but pop in occasionally. One other thing that's often not thought about is when people put out the seed, the birds flick the seed on the ground. What happens to that seed? It then encourages rats and mice to come and feed on the seed on the ground, and often feed in on the bird feeder as well. So you're actually encouraging vermin to feed and live in your property. And I'm sure there's not too many people that will be quite happy with a family or two or three of black rats running around in their roof, under their house, potentially even through the house. So there's a number of things to consider about feeding fauna. The interaction is great, but how do we do it so everybody benefits some without the detriment to one or the other? So this is a cover. Flying foxes particularly get caught in netting, and the carers from all over the place talk about flying foxes get caught in netting, getting part of their wings caught in that old mesh style netting that you used to be able to pick up. This is a more close weave netting that the animals can land on top of, but they don't get caught. So you can see it's actually quite a fine weave. It's like a loose weave shade cloth almost, but it does help keep the animals off the fruit if the primary purpose of having your fruit trees is to actually have the fruit itself. One last thing I want to touch on, if we're talking about fauna in the backyard in our suburbs, then we really need to take this next bit seriously. We're talking about responsible pet ownership. It's okay to have pets. I have a pet, and you'll see that in a moment. But when pets and wildlife mix, it's normally not the wildlife that come out on top. Quite a few of our feral animals originated from domestic animals, such as cats, wild dogs. There's a number of birds that have potentially become feral, like feral pigeons, etc. Some disturbing research about pets and wildlife, and it's not just about cats. I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute, but I just want to share this video. This is a domesticated cat. That was my Bengal, Wilbur. He talks to every bird out he can see outside the window, meows and purrs and stalks them inside, but we would never let him out. We value our wildlife outside our window and outside our house, and the pet can stay inside. So cats. Recent research from the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, AWC, estimated that a feral cat kills between 5 and 30 animals a day. Keep that in mind when we do the maths for the next bit. Conservative estimates across Australia say that there are 4 million feral cats. So we're looking at between 20 and 120 million animals a day are potentially killed by feral cats. Now, obviously, some of those might be rabbits, and they might be house mice, and they might be black rats and other introduced fauna. But even if only 20% of that is native, you're still looking at millions and millions of native animals killed a day. And according to Agricultural Victoria, there's up to 500,000 unowned cats in Victoria alone. So that's cats that wander from house to house, live in the neighbourhood cat that doesn't actually have an owner but gets fed by everybody is included in that. Dogs don't get off lightly either. The next lot of information comes from Queensland, but it's appropriate to show impact of dogs on wildlife. So Queensland Department of Environment Heritage, or whatever it's called these days, statistics show that approximately 110 koalas are attacked and killed by dogs each year. And in Queensland and New South Wales and the ACT, koalas are an endangered, a federally endangered species. They're not in Victoria, South Australia, but they are listed as koalas in those areas are a threatened species. And 110 get knocked off by a dog thereabouts every year. So the Mogul Koala Hospital, which is on the western suburb outskirts of Brisbane, and the Australian Wildlife Hospital at Beale, which is, I think, from memory, part of Australia Zoo, had admitted around, in the 10 years thereabouts, admitted around 1,400 animal koalas that had been attacked by dogs. And I know in Ballarat, when I was up there, lived up there as a youngster and as a student, you know, numbers of koalas were being attacked by dogs in the suburbs where koalas existed. So dog attacks primarily occurred in the backyard, if that's where and most of those were fatal, making that the dog attacks the third most common cause of koala death after disease and vehicle strikes in Queensland. So, you know, and there's often dogs in your shared paths, and, you know, you see people who walk their dogs and they don't have them on the lead, and the dogs go hair off after, jump in the water and chase ducks and hassle water birds and do all sorts of other things. That's not particularly responsible pet ownership, particularly, you know, you can do it, you can take your dog, put it on a lead, do what it has to do, get its enjoyment, go to a dog park if you have to, where it can run around and do what it likes. But being a responsible pet owner is also part and parcel of being somebody who wants to keep the fauna in their suburbs, in their backyards, because without those issues, there is you can't have both. You can't have your dog or your cat running around every day, overnight, whatever. Oh, kitty won't hurt anybody. The number of people I've heard say, oh, my cat wouldn't kill anything. Or my dog's okay. Yeah, it doesn't always turn out that way. Often there's many animals out there that create a fair bit of havoc, particularly for the local fauna. Okay, so that's the presentation. So what we can do, what the fauna need, what are some of the common species that we have in our suburbs, and I said whether it be Melbourne or Sydney or wherever, and what some of the things we can do in our own backyards. It doesn't have to be big. As I said, we've got 450 square metres, of which most of it is a house. It's little bits of backyard, but what we've been able to achieve is fairly good. We have a bird list of around 40 species that we've seen from the house, to about 5 or 6 species of mammals, 4 species of reptiles, and a frog in Croydon. So it's not out of suburb, it's not in the suburbs either, but it's still, you know, a fairly substantial patch, and it's just by making little things, take little actions to help create a bit better environment. Okay, so thanks to Anthony and the First Friends of Dandenong Creek. That's their web, as I know this has been recorded, that's their Facebook page. Thank you, Paul, as well, from Victorian Environment Friends Network, to Akash and Karen for permission to use some of their photos. And if you'd like some information or you have other questions after tonight, please check out our website, our Facebook page, or email us. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thanks, John. We were going to allow a bit of time for questions, but we've probably gone way over time now. There was a couple of questions that you might want to comment on. One was on millipedes, where they're from. They're called Portuguese millipedes, but we used to have them around our place, and sometimes at this time of year would be a scene from a Harrison Ford movie with millipedes invading the house. But since we've planted the place out thickly with native stuff and got the birds around, they're not so bad. So I don't know if the birds clean them up a bit. But do you have any comments on the millipedes, the Portuguese millipedes? The
Portuguese millipede, obviously, they are a European species, as the name would suggest. They do get in quite numbers, and like a lot of the pest animals or pest fauna that we have, a lot of them were introduced by acclimatisation societies, etc. Some have literally just landed in Australia in bits and pieces, you know, in whether it be with early settlers and it was in their, in their food supplies, in their equipment, etc. But yes, so they are, and they will breed quite heavily, and particularly on rainy, warm, damp nights, etc. That you'll see them almost swarming, as you said from a Harrison Ford movie. Yes, almost swarm, but some of the birds will eat them. Planning out an environment that creates a less desirable environment for them, or encourages other things, other wildlife in that will prey on them, can help without the need for any without the need for any pesticides and things like that.
And the other thing that quite caught my eye, there's been a lot of questions and comments on the group chat as we've gone, John. But one that caught my eye was a question about guerrilla plantings. Do you have a view on guerrilla plantings in the nature strips and stuff?
I actually quite like the idea of a nature strip being just that, for nature. There's probably some councils that are more willing to, take on that idea, but as long as it's done legally and you're not breaking any laws, I wouldn't like to condone illegal activity. But I often think myself, geez, that nature strip there near those traffic lights would just do with a good bit of mulch and a bit of a plant up and make it look good. But it's, as I said, some councils are actually taking that on more, and the nature strip is becoming, the nature strip rather than just a patch of lawn that you've got to go out and mow every so often.
And just really quickly, because there's one last comment from Anne. Any comments on currawongs? I'm not sure what that might be. Currawongs have kind of not, traditionally been, particularly the pied currawongs, have traditionally been autumn winter visitors when the higher elevations have got too cold, so they come down to the suburbs. Now they've discovered that the suburbs are a great place to live all year round. And partly, I have a neighbour that feeds the currawongs and the magpies, etc. But the currawongs have discovered there's this whole resource of small chicks and small birds and other things and rubbish and litter and food refuse and stuff that they can quite happily live on. So they are known to take lots of chicks from nests, etc., chicks of other birds from nests. So they are becoming a bit of a problem. And I suppose, again, it's depending how what the situations are. So if the local environment's out of balance, then something like currawongs can tip it even further out of balance, because they're coming in and making the most of a resource that they may not have made use of 20, 30 years ago, because they'd only come of a winter time, autumn, winter, and go again. But now they're here all year round, so they're obviously found a resource that they can use, and often that's to the detriment of other native wildlife. Yes, it's a very competitive world out there, and I guess that emphasises the need for, or the point of focusing on Indigenous species, because you're creating the environment that the local wildlife is used to more.
Yeah, and it also just looks at trying to get things back into a balance. It doesn't have to be, all one or the other, but somewhere along a balance between the biodiversity and humans, etc. We can get that balance. We're going to have a much better environment to live in. Like during lockdown at the moment, obviously we can't go too far in Melbourne. We get an hour out a day to go for a walk. So I tend to go for a walk around the Dorset Gardens or the Dorset Golf Course, and just take notes on what birds I see. I might get only 10, 20 birds, different birds a day, different species a day, but take notes, put that into some citizen science, and it's just an appreciation for what's there, and rather than walk around the oval or the athletics track and see almost nothing, just to get out and enjoy those little patches of nature. And it's at the moment, it's probably what's keeping a lot of people sane, that 1 hour a day where they can get out and go and walk, and hopefully some people will pick up the enjoyment, will understand the enjoyment of the natural environment around them. We often hear magpies warbling in that big gum tree out the front of our house at midnight, and you just go, yeah, we probably wouldn't have heard that, we wouldn't have cared much for it, 6 months ago. But just those little patches of nature often help keep people sane, particularly in a pandemic like we've got at the moment.
Yep, we'll have to wind it up. There's been a question about needing to check out the indigenous species suitable for a particular area, there's a classic book, Flora of Melbourne, I think it's called.
Yes, Margaret Paul, yes.
That's probably not the one I'm thinking of, but there are several books around that you can follow that.
Yeah, there's a big book, yay big, Flora of Melbourne. Often, hang on, I've got, if I can get this one on the screen. This one.
Not real clear. Perhaps we can put it up on the Facebook page.
Yeah, so one of the councils, so there's a Maroondah Council have one, I know Manningham Council have one, I think Whitehorse and Knox have little books that talk about what are the and Frankston talk about what are the some of the indigenous flora from that council area, which can be really helpful in terms of choosing what kind of plants that you might want to put in, you've got colours and things like that. And that's where those indigenous garden nurseries come in handy as well. They can guide you along the path of what might be suitable, what looks good, what heights and colours and things like that are all part of it.
Yep. Okay, I promised to wind it up 15 minutes ago, and we better do that. And thank you very much, John, for your presentation. A reminder to everyone that we will have a recording of the session available on the Facebook pages of First Friends of Dandenong Creek and also the Victorian Environment Friends Network. I won't give a long plug to how to become your group can become a member of the Victorian Environment Friends Network, but just to say that it is important that we have a strong representative group speaking out for friends groups and their special areas. So I hope that you'll look us up and find a way to join us. But thanks again, John. Thanks to Anthony for coordinating it all. And thank you all for coming.